There's a story people have told for centuries about the day the birds chose their king. The rule was simple. Whoever flew the highest would wear the crown. So they all went up together, and one by one they fell away, until only the eagle was left, climbing higher than any bird had ever climbed, higher than anything could follow. That's when it happened. A tiny brown bird, the one nobody had even noticed, crept out from where it had been hiding, deep in the eagle's feathers, the whole way up. It hopped into the air, just above the eagle's head, and it stole the crown. That bird was the wren, the smallest, shyest thing in your garden. So small it creeps along the bottom of the hedge, more like a mouse than a bird. And here's the strange part. The real wren's every bit as cunning as the one in that old story. It's earned that crown for real, with a voice far too big for its body, and a courtship so odd it sounds made up. By the end of this, you'll know both. Why we've called this tiny bird the king of birds for centuries, and why the living one out in your hedge has genuinely earned the title. And it starts with the 6 nests every male builds each spring and leaves standing empty. So, let's take a proper look at the smallest king in Britain. Here's the first surprise, and it's a big one. The wren's the commonest breeding bird in the whole country. It beats the robin. It beats the blackbird, the sparrow, and the starling. Right at the top of that list, above the lot of them, sits the wren. There are around 11 million breeding pairs of them across Britain. That's roughly 1 in every 8 breeding birds in the land. Line up 8 birds nesting in Britain this spring, and the odds are one of them's a wren. And yet, most people couldn't point to a single one. Stop and think about that. The most numerous bird you've got, and it's all but invisible. You could stand in your garden every day for a year and barely clap eyes on it, while it's living in your hedge the whole time. The reason's in the way it lives. The wren's tiny, one of the very smallest birds in Britain, at about 9 or 10 grams, and it spends its whole life down low in the shadows, in the tangle at the base of the hedge, under the shed, in the ivy on the wall, in the dead leaves at the back of the border. It's mouse-brown, round-bodied, with a short little tail cocked straight up, and it creeps through the undergrowth more like a mouse than a bird. Its scientific name even says so. Troglodytes. It means cave dweller, a nod to the way it disappears into every dark crevice and hole it can find. Part of why there are so many is that a wren will live almost anywhere. Gardens, woods, farmland, reed beds, moorland sea cliffs, and remote islands miles out in the Atlantic. Give it a bit of low cover and a supply of insects and spiders to pick out of it, and it'll make a living. That's how one tiny bird ended up the most widespread of the lot, turning up in places you wouldn't expect to find much of anything at all. So how do you ever spot a bird this determined to stay hidden? 3 giveaways. The first is that tail, almost always cocked straight up over its back like a little flag. The second is the way it moves, a low, fast, whirring dash from one patch of cover to the next, close to the ground, gone before you can quite focus on it. And the third, the most useful of the lot, is the sound it makes when it's cross. A hard, scolding, ticking call. Tick, 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 tick. Like 2 small stones tapped together, fast and angry. Learn that one sound, and you'll suddenly notice how many wrens have been sitting a few feet from you all along. So you've got a bird that's everywhere, and almost never seen. Which raises the obvious question. How does a bird like that, the smallest and shyest thing in the garden, end up crowned king of all the birds? Twice over, as it turns out. Once in the old stories, and once for real. Let's start with the stories. The tale of the wren and the eagle is one of the oldest bird stories in Europe. Versions of it turn up across Britain, Ireland, and far beyond, and people were telling it for hundreds of years before anyone wrote it down. The heart of it never changes. The birds want a king. They agree the highest flyer wins the crown, and the great and the powerful all take part, certain that raw strength will settle it. The eagle, biggest and strongest of the lot, climbs higher than any other bird can manage. But the wren cheats. Instead of trying to outfly anyone, it just hides in the eagle's feathers. It rides up on the back of all that effort. And at the very top, when the exhausted eagle can climb no further, the little wren slips out and flaps a few inches higher. Highest bird wins. And by the letter of the rule, the wren wins. It's a story about brains beating brawn, about the smallest, cleverest creature outwitting the strongest. And it stuck to the wren so firmly that its old country names still carry the crown. In parts of Britain and Ireland, it was known as the king of birds outright, and folklore treated it as royalty. There's a lovely echo of all this in your pocket, or at least there used to be. For nearly 20 years, from 1937 right up to 1956, the wren was the bird chosen for the British farthing, the smallest coin in the land, the smallest bird on the smallest coin. Whoever picked it clearly got the joke. Now here's the darker turn, and it's a real piece of history. For all that the wren was called a king, there was an old midwinter custom of hunting it. On the 26th of December, St. Stephen's Day, groups of people known as wren boys would go out. The tradition was to catch a single wren and carry it from door to door. It ran for centuries across Ireland, the Isle of Man, and parts of Britain. These days the bird's spared. Where the custom survives, the wren boys parade with a fake wren, and it's become a bit of midwinter music and costume. But it tells you how deep this tiny bird runs in our folklore. Crowned as a king and chased through the hedges in the dead of winter, all in the same breath. So that's the legend. A little bird that took a crown by being clever instead of strong. And here's the thing. The living bird out in your garden right now is pulling almost exactly the same trick. There's a good chance you've never actually seen a wren, even though you've almost certainly heard one. So it's worth asking yourself, honestly, have you ever set eyes on one, or only ever heard it? For most people, it's only ever the voice. A song heard 100 times, without once catching sight of the bird behind it. If that's you, say so below. It's about the clearest measure there is of how completely this little bird hides in plain sight. Because the first way the wren rules your garden is with its voice. You almost always hear a wren long before you see it. And when you do hear it, it's hard to believe the sound's coming from something so small. It's a torrent of fast, hard song that ends in a long, trembling trill. And it's loud, startlingly loud. Few birds anywhere pack that much volume into that little a body. Stand near a singing wren, and you can almost feel the effort of it. The whole bird shakes with it, tail cocked, throat trembling, everything thrown into the sound. And there's a good reason it sings so hard. Remember where the wren lives. Down low, buried in thick cover, out of sight. A bird hidden in the hedge has a problem. It still needs to tell every rival male for gardens around exactly where its patch ends, and to keep off. It can't do that by being seen, because nothing can see it in there. So it does it by being heard. The song has to punch out through all those leaves and branches and carry right across the territory, and that takes real power. So that volume's a tool. It's how a tiny bird makes itself impossible to ignore, from a place where nothing can see it, and the wren barely lets up. It's one of the most persistent singers you've got, hammering out that same fierce song right through spring and summer, and carrying on far later into the year than most, when the garden's otherwise gone quiet. For its size, the sheer output's astonishing, hour after hour from one of the smallest birds in the country. And it works. A male wren will hold his patch of your garden against every other male, standing his ground with a voice you can hear streets away, while he himself stays hidden in the green. And he's a scrapper with it. For all his size, a male wren will square up to a rival at the edge of his territory, wings flicking, tail up, refusing to give an inch. For a bird this small, that's an extraordinary amount of nerve. He behaves as though he owns the place, but the voice is only how the wren claims his kingdom. What he does with it, once a female's listening, is where this gets strange. Here's the part I promised you right at the start. The 6 nests. Most garden birds build a single nest. A pair gets together, they build a home, they raise their young in it. Simple. The male wren does something else entirely. In early spring, before he's even won a female, a male wren starts building, and he builds several nests at once, 5, 6, sometimes more, dotted about his territory, each one a neat, round, domed ball of moss, grass and dead leaves, tucked into a bank, a wall, an ivy tangle or a shed corner. He builds every one of them himself, and every single one of them is empty. These are the famous cock nests, a whole row of little half-finished show homes, built by one small bird, with no family in any of them, yet, because those nests start out as an audition. When a female arrives, drawn in by all that singing, the male stops and shows her round. He leads her from nest to nest, singing and displaying at each one, almost like an estate agent walking a buyer down a street of empty houses. And she inspects them. She goes inside. She takes her time. She's judging the quality of his building and the vigor of the male who made it. If she approves of him and of one of his nests, she picks that nest and she finishes it herself, lining the inside with soft feathers to make it fit for young. And the shape of that nest is worth a word, because it's all about safety. Each one's a domed ball with a single small round entrance hole in the side. A tiny bird with tiny young is a meal for all sorts, from cats to jays. So the wren builds a snug, hidden, almost sealed little chamber with just one way in. Inside her chosen one, the female lays a clutch of 5 or 6 astonishingly small eggs, and she does the sitting herself. In a good summer, a pair can run 2 broods through before the season's out. The rest of his little show homes just sit there empty, and all that spare building is exactly why the whole thing pays off. A male who builds well on a good territory can attract more than one female. And because he's got a row of nests ready to go, a second female can settle into a different one and raise her own brood with him at the same time. In parts of Britain, especially in the south, a single strong male wren can end up supporting 2 or even 3 females across his patch of nests. And here's the ruthless part. A male with more than one female on the go might leave the first to raise her chicks largely on her own, while he turns his attention and his spare nests to courting the next. For every male who wins several mates like that, there are others, on poorer ground, or simply not building well enough, who reach the end of spring with none at all. So those 6 empty nests are the engine of a whole competitive courtship. The best builder, on the best patch, with the biggest voice, takes several mates and fathers, the most young. The crown, in other words, goes to the cleverest and most capable, which is the same story as the legend, played out for real in the ivy on your wall. One thing worth passing on before the final part. Most of what we've just talked about, the empty nests, the hidden singer, the commonest bird you never see, is happening in ordinary gardens all over the country, and almost nobody ever notices. So I've put together a free guide to the garden birds of Britain and Northern Ireland, what each of them's really up to, month by month, and how to read it for yourself. It's called Reading Your Garden Birds. It runs to 16 illustrated pages, and it costs nothing. The link's in the description and pinned at the top of the comments at guide.ukgardenbirds.com. It's the perfect companion to these little films. So put it all together, and the crown starts to make a lot of sense. The wren's the most numerous bird in the country, hiding in plain sight in every hedge and garden. It holds its ground with a voice far bigger than its body has any right to produce, and it runs one of the boldest courtships of any bird you've got. A tiny male juggling a row of nests and more than one mate, winning or losing it all, on how well he builds and how hard he sings. All of that comes from nerve and cleverness. Size has almost nothing to do with it. The wren's small, easy to miss, and never the bird you notice first. And still it behaves, in every way that matters, like it's in charge. The old storytellers gave the wren its crown because a little bird outwitted an eagle. They had the right bird. They just didn't know the half of what it gets up to in the hedge. So the next time you're out in the garden and you hear that sudden burst of song, far too loud, coming from somewhere in the depths of a hedge you can't quite see into, stop for a second. That's the king of birds, one of the smallest birds you've got, and quietly one of the most impressive. Somewhere in there's a mouse-brown scrap of a thing with its tail cocked, holding a whole territory with its voice, and running a row of empty houses, waiting for a female to choose. Not bad for the bird you never see. And if you want another small garden bird that turns out to be far cleverer than it looks, I made a whole film about the great tit and the secret alarm call language it uses to warn the garden about specific predators. You can watch that one right here. Keep listening to your hedges, and I'll see you in the next one.